Chapter 5. Language, Thought, Ideology. When a child learns language, he or she actually makes the sounds that the parental adult makes based on a prior apprehension of the parental adult's meaning. I learned this truth when Lisa and I were raising our son Sam, now a grown man. From birth, or prenatally, Sam immediately began to experience us experiencing him, began to take in his sense of our love for him, and also the limitations we have been conditioned unconsciously to place on that love, but also the total surround of human relations that form our culture, and the conflict within that surround between the desire for mutual recognition and the fear that in part contains it. Sam absorbed all of this intuitively and, of course, pre-linguistically as the possible psychospiritual field of his own coming into being as a social person. As every parent knows, this vast intuitive flow of mutuality is saturated with the mutual understanding that the German phenomenologists call Verstehen, which is to say that the meaning of all human interactions and the symbolic world that mediates and encodes those interactions are instantly comprehended by the newly born infant without being interpreted reflectively. Thus, if a parent is cold and anxious in the first few days after a baby is born, the baby will start to be anxious and cold because he or she understands in his or her being that this complex mixture of presence and absence is a condition of the connection. Although the baby and young child exudes a transcendent authenticity and desire that will pull for a long time on the parent's withdrawn self-regulation. Or to give another common example drawn from Sam's history, the child will understand, will comprehend the social requirement of gender long before he knows through language that he is a boy. And this is so even if he initially likes to wear dresses and is actively supported by his parents in doing so. From the surrounding world, he will soon shun the outer appearance of girls because he simply grasps through the vibes of the socio-psycho-spiritual field into which he is more or less instantly integrated that he cannot otherwise gain a stable and good recognition as a social person in the social world into which he has been thrown. Sam used to wear dresses, and he really liked wearing dresses for a while. He had, blonde, curly hair, and all of a sudden he didn't want to wear them anymore. And that's because he was internalizing the totality. We supported Sam wearing dresses. He looked great in dresses. But because he internalized the totality of genderification, that led him to realize that to be okay in his assigned outer identity as a boy, he couldn't wear dresses. He couldn't have the outer appearance of a girl. That was intuited long before he knew much language. It's picked up from the vibes of the field, and then language is built on that. Thus, the transmission of social meaning in all its complexity is conveyed to and understood intuitively by the child before he or she begins to use language. Being is prior to thought. To be clear, the adult's use of language is, of course, an important part of what the child understands at the level of connotative sound, without him or her being able to interpret the what of what is being said. The intention in the sound itself conveys meaning before the sounds are understood as significations. And it is on the basis of this prior intuition of the world of the adult's meanings that the child will gradually, after about a year of listening and experiencing the sensual totality of parental self-expression, including spoken language, that the child will begin to make the same sounds the parent makes to make these previously understood meanings visible in reflection. This is why children, once they start to realize that they can make the same sounds the parent makes, learn language so remarkably quickly. Their global comprehension of the meanings of the entire intersubjective interactional field has already laid down the terrain to be signified, so that to become a speaker of language, they only need to make the signifying sounds that reveal what they have already comprehended. Language thus reveals already understood meaning and creates a new ground of mutuality on which the child can stand with the others in his or her world, a kind of second level of reciprocity built entirely on the first. Language adds to the child's sense of withness by allowing him or her to make sounds together with others that make visible the already understood meanings. But this is not and cannot be an unmixed blessing, because the limitations on mutual recognition present in the social psycho-spiritual field are carried within the connotations of the sounds themselves, as well as through the denotative signs of the language. So it's the sound of the word and the denotative meaning of the word are both carried in the sound. I mean, the meaning of the sound, the intention in the sound, the degree of loving energy or non-loving energy in the sound is carried in the sound in addition to what the word sounded out actually means denotatively. When I was in my 20s, I took peyote for the first time with two friends while we were at the racetrack, because we thought it would be a fun place to have a mind-altering experience. But as the drug started to affect us, we instantly realized that we had made a mistake, that the racetrack was actually a ghastly manifestation of many forms of social alienation, in something of the way that this same congeries of distortion is conveyed in the amusement park scenes in Alfred Hitchcock's Stranger on a Train, or Orson Welles' film The Third Man. In these amusement park scenes, there's sort of the swirling horror of the Ferris wheel and the caricatured portrayal of people's faces that both Hitchcock and Welles were very brilliant at conveying. That's how the racetrack looked to us at that moment. So the three of us hurriedly left the racetrack and went back to my apartment, where we turned on the radio, which was playing Bach's Second Double Violin Concerto. Almost immediately, the three of us began crying at the extraordinary beauty of the music, sharing the relief we experienced as the beautiful sounds of the violins evoked a kind of healing communion among us. But when a human voice came on to tell us in words of a station break, we each became painfully aware of the loss we suffered as the music gave way to the monotone of the speaker, and as the evocative sounds of the violins were interrupted by the informational sounds contained in the verbal announcement. What was suddenly revealed to us, and what I remember so well more than 40 years later, was the connotative power of language as a limiting terrain of social being, the mere hearing of which served to rob us temporarily of the communion of being we had felt so deeply a moment before. So our way of talking, the sound of our talking conveys meaning, not just the what of what we are saying. The sound itself. So different, Bach's double violin concerto from the person who interrupted it for a station break, in that monotone of, this is a station break. This is to say that the connotation of discourse expresses precisely the level of alienation transmitted in the pre-discursive psychospiritual field out of which the language emerges. As Sartre has emphasized in his critique of those semioticians who treat language as a text, as a kind of disassociated field of signs to be analyzed from the outside, language is always spoken, and so it can only express what the speaker is capable of uttering through the limits and potentialities, through both the limits and potentialities of his or her social conditioning. This means that the participants in a culture signify how they exist, or better, who they are, in what they say. Their words are backed up by intentions comprehended through their language that transmit the blend of desire for and fear of the other that I have been describing up to this point. And to the extent that fear of the other colors the psychospiritual field constituting the cultural environment, to that extent the inhibition on intersubjective connection saturating that psychospiritual field also saturates the meanings of their spoken language. Their collective being, which we could call their who, grounds the meanings of the discourse they are able to share, which is their what. Or to say this more simply, through language we only illuminate what we want to be seen. So if we speak in a monotone, I'm trying not to speak too much in a monotone, but if I were to speak in a monotone, the way language can be spoken, no matter what the words are that I'm speaking, the being that I'm allowing to be seen is flat. It's not supple, vulnerable, open-hearted. So you can't express an open-hearted intention through a monotone way of speaking it. The monotone limits the potentiality of what can be expressed. And in a culture which flattens its language that way, there's a collective repression of the open-heartedness and vulnerability that people don't want to reveal to each other, no matter what words are spoken. So you can say the most beautiful Shakespeare, but if you say it in a monotonous way, it's going to convey a monotonous meaning. To be or not to be, that was the question. This realization helps us to understand the meaning of the important idea of reification, as that idea is used in Marxist and neo-Marxist theory. Reification means literally making something into a thing, a res, R-E-S, in Latin. But its meaning in analyses of culture describes the way that we take an existing cultural reality as if it had a fixed character, transforming a contingent reality created by human beings into something that appears to be natural and given, as simply the way things are. I recall the following example from a phenomenon I witnessed following the second election of Ronald Reagan in 1984. After having been part of the social movements of the 1960s, when I had experienced the palpable reality of social change through my participation in the shared experience of the parallel universe of the 60s counterculture, which lasted far longer than the 60s and perhaps still has not been completely extinguished. I was in 1984 astonished to see a new generation of young people coming into their 20s and beginning to head off to Wall Street to work in the stock market. Whereas those of us living in the counterculture had sensed at least the intimation of living in a new world that would dissolve collective belief in the received institutions of the society that we had inherited, I suddenly realized that as our movements were abating, this new generation was re-believing in these inherited institutions and reattributing to these institutions a fixed character as if they were simply there. Whereas to me, under the influence of the transcendent world coming into being through the movements of which I was a part, the stock market had come to acquire a phantasmagoric and comic character, a massive gambling operation whose comical essence had been perfectly captured by Abbie Hoffman when he famously dropped dollar bills from the visitor's balcony above the actual market floor onto the traders below, creating havoc, everybody grabbing for the floating dollar bills. To this new generation, this stock market was once again being taken seriously as if it were a kind of real thing, at which one got a job and to which one might devote his or her entire life, often his or her whole life. Sorry, I misread that. Okay, I'm going to read that sentence again. It's a long sentence.
That's okay. This is like firing my brain.
Okay. Whereas to me, under the influence of the transcendent world, coming into being through the movements of which I was a part, the stock market had come to acquire a phantasmagoric and comic character, a massive gambling operation whose comical essence had been perfectly captured by Abbie Hoffman when he famously dropped dollar bills from the visitor's balcony above the actual market floor onto the traders below. So Abbie captured the way we were revealing the stock market as like a obsessive-compulsive gambling operation, just like Las Vegas, in which stocks would go up and down, people wildly betting on which direction they'd go. Abbie dropped the dollar bills from the balcony down onto the traders below to sort of reveal this through comedy and theater, political theater, and of course people grabbed the dollar bills as they floated down on top of them.
Just that concept is that when you go to the sport, like the basketball games, everyone, like, you'll pay $1,000 for a seat, and then they'll give away like free French fries from the ceiling or something. They'll be floating down, and you'll see people just going absolutely mad for it. And
That's a good point.
It reveals. I think it was that same energy of.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. Sorry to...
No, that's okay. But the dollar bills really fit perfectly with the stock market's own activity, which is dollar bills.
Dollar bills.
So, to this new generation, this stock market was once again being taken seriously as if it were a kind of real thing, at which one got a job and to which one might devote his or her actual life, often his or her whole life. To this new generation, the stock market had become reified as simply a fact of the society, a completely normal source of wealth and value that one should, if possible, seek to append oneself to, an institution which these young people, enthusiastic in their suits and increasingly dresses or pantsuits, were experiencing as a thing, as simply a given aspect of the world. So whereas the social movement had all of a sudden made the stock market look, first of all, made up, and second, absurd in a way that could be made fun of. It once again regained its fixed quality as if it were the stock market. Of course, you go to work at the stock market. If you can get a job with Merrill Lynch or one of these firms, it regained that quality after Reagan won the second time, and the movements really started to abate, and it looked like the reinstitution of the conservative vision of the society was being reestablished. To this new generation, the stock market had become reified as simply a fact of the society, a completely normal source of wealth and value that one should, if possible, seek to append oneself to, an institution which these young people, enthusiastic in their suits and increasingly dresses or pantsuits, were experiencing as a thing, as simply a given aspect of the world. So I repeated that sentence. You use whichever one is better. Thus, reification is a quality of experience rather than an aspect of language as such, a way of seeing the world as if it were two-dimensional instead of three-dimensional. And when we believe in existing reality in this fixed character way, we render ourselves passive and make the world active, as if the institutions of the existing cultural reality are simply recruiting us to become part of the real world that they are creating and recreating. For Marx, reification was the result of what he called the fetishism of commodities, through which the true social relations, shaped by the material productive relations of the capitalist system, come to be masked by the relationships of exchange of goods and services, including human labor, as they are simply being repetitively bought and sold within the capitalist marketplace, such that the value of everything and everyone appears to be created by the market. And Marx linked this conception of reification to the alienation of labor, in which the worker becomes a mere cog in the machine, reduced to performing mechanical functions, valued not as sensuous labor directed toward realizing a socially useful product, embodying his or her own meaningful intentions, but rather as mere labor power, contributing to the creation of a product whose purpose the worker has no meaningful and creative relationship to, because the product is assembled by the capitalist production process and obtains its value primarily through its exchange value in the market. Marx understands the process of reification, or to use his word, the process of fetishism, as resulting from the divorcing of the worker from the product of his or her labor, which creates in the worker the self-experience that he or she is a mere function of a system outside of him or herself. The limitation of Marx's description, however, actually, before I say that, let me just make sure this is understandable. So if you think the stock market, it's just the stock market, and that's one of the things that we have in the society is the stock market. You can get a job with it, and you get a good job with it with a high salary, and that's where stocks and bonds are traded, and you just see it as if it were a thing, an object. When you do that, you are not seeing it in its truly historical way as a created reality, social reality, that is coming into existence through people actually creating it, and it's dissolving, so that eventually it'll be superseded by some other social form. You don't see it in that creative way. You see it as just as if it were a thing there. And when you see it in the created way, you can also see You can also see that it can be changed, that it can be transformed. You don't see it as a fixed thing. When you see it as a fixed thing, as if it were just there, you're reifying it. You're turning it into a thing. And therefore, when you turn it into a thing that you can get a job with, you make that thing the active force in the society, all the things that are around us, all interacting with each other, and yourself into a passive observer of that thing. You can get a job with it, as if you work for it or in it. Rather than we are the active creators of this. We are the active co-creators of this. And when, of course, in Abbie Hoffman's hands, that's revealed in a comical way when he tries to show this is a form of collective madness that we have invented, that we need to unravel, dissolve. We don't need to be run by everybody's capacity to eat and live in housing and have a materially decent life is determined by this this gambling operation that goes up and down. The limitation of Marx's description, however, is that it locates both the problem of the alienation of labor and the resolution of this problem in the process of material production rather than in the intersubjective psychospiritual alienation of self from other that produces and reproduces the material production process in the first place. We are blocked from experiencing the dehumanizing character of the hierarchies of capitalist production or of the competitive, profit-driven, money-valuing marketplace, not by the form of production as such, but by our felt need to deny our desire for mutual recognition and our fear of ontological humiliation by others if we reveal who we really are and what we truly long for. Thus, the worker who is disconnected from, alienated from, thus the worker who is disconnected from, alienated from, the product of his or her labor, is already enveloped in a milieu of experiential isolation and social separation, hardened by his or her own conditioning to pledge a kind of existential allegiance to the world as it is, because that world, he or she has learned over the course of his or her life from birth, is the condition of social membership. The worker fetishizes the commodity form, to use Marxist language, not because he or she is cut off from the creation and use of the product of his or her labor, but because he or she has had no experiential intersubjective channel out of the inevitability of his or her reduction of him or herself to a mere function of the system, alienated from him or herself and alienated from the other. The solution to the worker's problem is not a reorganization of the production process as such from capitalism to socialism, but a disalienation of the psycho-spiritual field through the movement of collective intersubjective action through which he or she could come to realize his or her desire for authentic human connection, for mutual recognition. He or she needs to become part of the creation of a spiritually redemptive socialism, not a mere reorganization of the economic system in its material aspect. I think I need to explain this. Yeah? Okay, so just a second.